Good afternoon. Welcome to Open Classroom. I'm Janet Gillow here at the Brown School, Director of Professional Development. So glad to have you with us as part of today's program. For those of you joining on the Zoom webinar, as we shared, we can't see or hear you, but we love hearing from you. And many of you are saying hello in the chat right now, letting us know where you're coming from. We do appreciate that, and we do want you to be a part of the conversation. I want to extend a special welcome to anybody joining us on the YouTube stream. Unfortunately, we're not able to moderate Q&A from YouTube though. So before we get started today, I just want to let you know the next couple things we have coming up on the Open Classroom. You are welcome to come back for any and everything we do. It's all free and all open to absolutely everybody. So tomorrow, October 27th, we're doing the first of two panels regarding the Brown School's new strategic plan, Driving Equity 2030. If you're a stakeholder in our community or interested in what we're doing here at the school, please come to hear more about our plans for the years ahead. And then we'll be back on Thursday, November 4th. We've got colleagues with Heart of Missouri United Way, Rachel Delclue and Latoya Stevens, sharing a model that they are working on towards establishing a racial equity framework in organizations that goes beyond HR policies. So if that's something you're working on in your organization, they've got some great thoughts and they're ready to share them with you. But today's program is offered in partnership with the Center for Mental Health Services Research. To kick us off and introduce our speaker, please welcome Brown School Professor and CMHSR Co-Director, Leo Cabasa.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Janet. Muy buenas tardes. So welcome to our October Center for Mental Health Services Research monthly seminar series. Today, I have the great privilege of introducing Rosaura Orengo Aguayo. She's an associate professor and bilingual clinical psychologist at the National Crime Victims Research and Treatment Center within the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Health Sciences at the Medical University of South Carolina. Her research focuses on addressing mental health disparities among underserved populations, specifically among Hispanic youth, through innovative implementation and dissemination methods, including telehealth. Her presentation today, titled Partnerships and Adaptation to Implement Trauma-Focused Therapy in Low-Resource Settings in the US and Latin America, speaks highly of her work. And we're very excited to have her here today to present her work. Our next seminar series will be on November 17th. I'll drop that information in the chat. And what we'll do is Dr. Rosaura will be speaking for around 45 minutes, and then we'll take Q&A at the end. And please put your Q&A questions and comments in the chat, and I'll help moderate once we get to that part of our program. So with further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Rosaura Orengo Aguayo. Thank you so much, Rosaura. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Leo, for that introduction. And thank you so much to the Brown School of welcoming to this amazing forum. So today we're going to have an ambitious agenda, and I hope we can cover all of this. But really the goal is to describe some of the work our team has been doing to implement an evidence-based treatment for trauma in three different contexts: rural South Carolina, Puerto Rico, and El Salvador. And all these contexts have some things in common and some things that are nuances. So we're going to discuss those low resource environments. I think most importantly, my goal today is to really draw out some implications: cultural, humility, linguistic considerations, tailoring, and how all this relates to implementation science. And then tell you a little bit about my story as how I came to this. So hang tight. I hope you enjoy it. First of all, I'd like to take a moment to thank the entire team of collaborators that has made this work possible. It's not just me, it's a team from Puerto Rico and other countries, and some amazing current and past postdocs, interns, who are now faculty members across the nation. So to start us off, let's contextualize what are some of the barriers in access to evidence-based mental health treatment for trauma-exposed youth? You know, we know from the literature that there are significant less likelihood of getting services, racial and ethnic minority youth, to evidence-based mental health treatment. And why? You know, I never forget the story that my first trainer in TF-CBT and supervisor, Michael D'Ariano, told me, that, you know, families, Hispanic Latino families, showed up to intake, and then he never saw them again. And it wasn't for lack of interest. It was because of multiple jobs that caregivers had, difficulty driving downtown, paying for parking, limited availability of linguistically competent providers and culturally competent providers. And more recently, I mean, a global pandemic where our entire systems are shut down. So in response to this, you know, in 2015 at the Medical University of South Carolina, our team led by Dr. Regan Stewart started the telehealth outreach program for traumatic stress. And TOPS provides school-based and home-based telemental health treatment for trauma-exposed youth. You may notice an interesting fun fact. This is pre-COVID, and I was talking to some of my colleagues here about this, and people thought we were crazy. How is this going to work? How is this private? How is this confidential? No one's going to buy in. But our goal was to increase access to those kiddos that we don't want them to miss school. We don't want their caregivers to lose their jobs, and we want to see them every week for trauma treatment, especially rural and underserved populations. So pretty much what we started was a training clinic. Interns, postdocs, social workers, psychologists, a multidisciplinary team with the goal of delivering trauma-focused TF-CBT in Spanish and English to African-American youth, Hispanic, Latinx youth, etc. Since 2016, we've had a lot of visits, 3,500 and counting. And prior to the pandemic, the majority of our services were actually delivered in schools. And I'll explain a little bit about that in a second. So why trauma-focused CBT? For those of you who aren't familiar, this is an empirically validated multi-component psychotherapy model to treat trauma-exposed youth ages 3 to 18 with symptoms related to their trauma primarily, but they can have co-occurring depression, anxiety, behavioral problems. More than 23 RCTs have documented its efficacy. And some of these are conducted globally in different countries and continents. And it works. And we know we have data that it works. So it was prime for taking it to that next step of implementing it in a telehealth format. So how does this work? It's interesting. Prior to COVID, I had to do a lot of explanation. Now you all know how it goes. HIPAA compliant software. We want to make sure that you can share screen to share resources. We want to continue the same gold standard of evidence-based delivery through weekly visits and consultation with multidisciplinary team members if needed. What makes our program unique is that we really strive to provide bilingual, bicultural services through clinicians that are bilingual and bicultural. And we have also developed the first set of resources to deliver TF-CBT via telehealth. You can check them out in telehealthfortrauma.com. Fun fact, this website was created during COVID to rapidly spread everything that we had when it was most needed. And you'll find everything in English and in Spanish. So please check it out. We have created tons of resources, all with the goal of taking what we would do face-to-face via telehealth. And here are some cool outcomes. So our pilot study, this was published in 2020, and this data was collected from 2017 to 2020. We had about 70 children participate in this study, 19% male, 81% female, ages 7 to 18. And check this out, and this is so important. The vast majority, almost 9 out of 10 children in this study are racial and ethnic minority youth. 58% Hispanic Latino, 30% African American. And we want to also highlight that 34% of our sample received TF-CBT fully in Spanish. We primarily focus on 7 underserved communities in the state of South Carolina, and the services were provided. 63% of youth received it in school, meaning during recess or a free period or a specific time where it wouldn't interrupt seating time. A counselor, a principal would bring the child into a private location with equipment provided by our team and connect with the therapist in vivo to receive their sessions. And the caregiver would get an iPad from our program and connect with the therapist at different times to receive the caregiving sessions. Our outcomes were outstanding. 62 out of the 70 youth completed all treatment components of TF-CBT, which typically takes about 4 to 7 months to deliver. Weekly sessions with a caregiver, with a kid, and together. Also, 81% of caregivers fully participated in all the treatment components. So there was high caregiver engagement, high caregiver satisfaction. And it is important to note that kids got better. So the treatment effects were similar to in-person TF-CBT with large effect sizes of over 2. Just to put it in context, prior to COVID, prior to telehealth, typical RCTs for TF-CBT reported anywhere from 25 to 60% completion rates. And there's a reference there. So something important in terms of what did we learn from this? The first thing was that every single school we worked with or community agency, we first did an elaborate needs assessment to understand their mental health concerns, what they felt their students or their youth needed, what were their strengths, what was their familiarity with the technology and their openness to telehealth, and then we worked from there. Meg Wallace, who is the top coordinator, is an amazing social worker with vast years of experience doing TF-CBT, and her with Dr. Regan Stewart really paved the way to make this possible. Also, we didn't just leave it there. We constantly provided consultation, implementation support, tech support, on demand. They could contact us and we would be there. We also knew that we cannot expect schools and parents to have equipment readily available. Again, this was pre-COVID when this was all new. So we got grants to fund this equipment, and now we're teaching other organizations across the US and in Latin America how to obtain grants to fund equipment. Moreover, it's important to note our next steps with this work, and I'm only presenting a snapshot because we're going to move into 2 other contexts. We've recently obtained a National Child Traumatic Stress Network grant, category 2 from SAMHSA, where we're taking what we've learned in South Carolina and expanding it to all over the US and rural underserved communities in Puerto Rico, and teaching agencies how to implement telehealth and use telehealth and create resources. Future directions too, we got to talk about licensing and the importance of cross-state licensing. So check out SciPacs for more information. All right, so here are, and you will receive these handouts, all the papers that have come out of our lab, TOPS, and our clinic prior to COVID. And right now we're writing a lot of work underway. For those researchers out there who are interested in dissemination, implementation science, changing the world through science, I want you to know one thing. All of this work didn't come out of a research study. This came out of a clinic that had the goal of providing services to underserved youth, and then really evaluating this program and understanding it in real time and using mixed methods and really using a community-based participatory approach and writing our findings so that the world can know what we did and look at the outcomes. So I encourage you to read this and kind of think about how you can bring that to your community with whatever evidence-based therapy or program you're trying to implement. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit. So we talked about rural South Carolina. We learned a lot there, but now we're going to shift to Puerto Rico. So just a little bit of background. Natural disasters, we're talking severe weather events, earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, which sadly, these days you talk to anyone in the world and they've been hit by something like this, even a pandemic. They impact approximately 175 million children a year. And these effects are ramping up due to climate change. And we know from the literature that children exposed to natural disasters are at an increased risk of developing a host of mental health problems that require trauma-focused interventions. Also, we know that there's a lack of trained providers at multiple levels of intervention for trauma. So that's really important because it relates to Puerto Rico in particular. So I'm from Puerto Rico, born, raised, went to undergraduate there at the University of Puerto Rico, and we're a small island in the Caribbean, 100 miles east to west, 35 miles north to south, let that sink in, but it is gorgeous. We're a US territory, meaning we're United States citizens by birth, but we're one of the sort of last colonies remaining on Earth, meaning we don't vote for the President of the United States, but we're governed by the Constitution. We don't have a representative in Congress, but yet we have to follow the laws dictated by the federal government. And so this is really important as you'll see it play out. More on the context of the environment of Puerto Rico, it's gorgeous. Its citizens are used to being able to go to hundreds of miles of beaches, the only natural rainforest in the US, to really commune with nature and enjoy it. So as you can imagine, in September of 2017, Hurricane Maria, a Category 5 storm who impacted Puerto Rico as a Category 4 storm, only because the Saffir-Simpson scale broke and 155 miles is the last recorded mile per hour, so it made it a Cat 4. Impacted the island, strongest hurricane in over 80 years, $94 billion in damages. And most importantly, prior to COVID, this was the only disaster in the United States where 100% of citizens in one state territory were impacted. No one was spared. Furthermore, I think we forget the importance of electricity for everything we do in our life, including cell phone service. So the entire power grid of Puerto Rico was completely decimated, meaning the average citizen, if you were lucky, you got power back maybe 4 months after the storm. If you were one of the unlucky people, it took 12 months. That means no internet, no cell phone service. Most people in Puerto Rico no longer have landlines. So communication with the diaspora, their family members living in the mainland US, was disrupted. And it's the longest and largest power outage in modern US history. And as you're hearing this, I want you to let it sink in that Puerto Rico is part of the United States. And this is unheard of in many third world countries. So this is very unacceptable. On top of that, the first aid from the federal government arrived within 2 weeks to the port of San Juan and was held there due to controversy as to how to distribute it. So most citizens did not get aid within the first month after the storm. This resulted in many immediate deaths and compounding deaths due to lack of access to oxygen, medication, and food and water. And more so, it's the worst disaster to be documented by FEMA. Unfortunately, that has been surpassed in the recent cycle of hurricanes. So here, I have a picture of where I went to high school and took my history and Spanish course. And as you can imagine, the destruction is very close not only to the citizens living on the island, but the more than 4 million Puerto Ricans living abroad. 100% of public schools where most children receive their meals, sometimes their only meals during the day, where they receive social support and connection, education, were closed for at least 3 to 4 months after Maria. So this poses an even greater risk to children who depend on those routines, social support, and access to food and shelter. So pretty much immediately the day after, I remember being on the phone the day before Maria hit the island and talking to my mom. And my mom's a very cool, calm, collected person, very rational. And she said in Spanish, "Honey, this is bad." That was her summary. And I never imagined that would be the last time I heard from her in a couple of days. And, we were all panicking. And all of a sudden, I get a message maybe 48 hours after Maria impacted the island via WhatsApp from a colleague from grad school, Ed Marie, who is now at Harvard. She happened to be in Puerto Rico on vacation and got stuck there after Maria. Well, she and her husband drove to San Juan, the capital of Puerto Rico, a few days after Maria, where all the heads of state were meeting because there was no communication or power except there, to offer help, to say, how can we help? We're psychologists, we want to help. And they bumped into the secretary of the Department of Education, literally, and said, what do you need? And she said, our team needs trauma experts who are willing to help us out on what we need to do. They contacted me, and lo and behold, this collaboration began truly from a WhatsApp message, a need, and a common ground. So the Department of Education was really interested in understanding what were the mental health needs of youth in Puerto Rico so that they could target specific aid interventions at different levels throughout the island. They were willing to support us with volunteers to collect any form of data and wanted to make sure that they were evidence-based and informed. So our team didn't really do this type of work when Maria hit. We're trauma experts, but not natural disaster experts. So what do? We contacted the people who know. Dr. Annette LaGreca at the University of Miami, Dr. Melissa Breimer at UCLA, cold calls. Hey, you don't know me, but I need help. And these amazing group of men and women helped us identify the evidence-based measures created after Katrina, after 9/11. We translated it to Puerto Rican Spanish with the help of our colleagues and basically told the Department of Ed, here is the recommended items you should ask. How can we help? So they went and administered this questionnaire, which is admirable, zero funding, all paper pencil with no electricity, to 96,000 students across the island of Puerto Rico. Grades 3 to 12, 50% girls, 5 to 9 months after Maria. These results are published in JAMA Network Open. I want to highlight a few. This is the scale we used. It had validated PTSD symptoms, depressive symptoms, social support, and disaster exposure. So I want to highlight 3 major things. One of the biggest predictors of post-disaster development of PTSD is thinking you were going to die. And in this sample of over 96,000 youth, 30% of Puerto Rican children felt that they were going to die during Hurricane Maria. On top of that, another predictor of post-disaster recovery or lack thereof is how long did it take for you to get access to basic needs being met, such as food, water, and shelter. 32% of youth in Puerto Rico, over 31,000 youth, said that still 5 to 9 months after Maria, they didn't know where their water or food supply was going to come by on a day-to-day basis. Food insecurity, water insecurity. Furthermore, the literature shows us that social support is a key predictor to post-disaster recovery, particularly in Hispanic communities where the sense of familismo and this cultural idea that we're in this together as a community is so important. 57% of youth, over 55,000, said that a friend, a close friend or family member had left the island after Maria due to loss of jobs, home shelters, etc., disrupting entire systems of support. There's many other findings that you can check out in the paper, but these are very noteworthy. On top of that, we asked about possible symptoms of PTSD, and we had about 7% of the sample, about close to 7,000 kids, endorsing clinically significant self-reported PTSD symptoms. This is not an interview, which is interesting because in the post-disaster literature, after Katrina, after Hurricane Andrew, this is close to 30%, 20 to 30%. So we didn't see the expected increased rate. And it seems that if you were female, experienced greater destruction of property, thought you were going to die, that seemed to account for 20% of the variance in PTSD symptoms, okay? So there's a lot here that we could impact, but interestingly, your typical predictors of this, socioeconomic status, geographic location in terms of where the hurricane entered, distance from landfall, none of that predicted PTSD symptoms in kids, meaning that 100% of Puerto Rican youth had some sort of disaster exposure after Maria, that less kids than we expected endorsed clinically significant symptoms of PTSD. So there's something we didn't measure that is perhaps providing protection, conferring resilience, but that's an open question. And then there's a need regardless for multiple levels of intervention and support depending on the presentation of these kids. So what do we do with this information? And let me say a big caveat here. What I'm presenting seems very logical, chronological, but it didn't start there. Our team actually started 3 weeks after Maria, being on the ground, taking relief supplies to various nonprofits and family members and providing training in psychological first aid. Psychological first aid is the first line of treatment provided or recommended after a disaster, after a terrorist attack, and it's not therapy in any way, shape, or form. In fact, that is contraindicated. So really the first weeks after disaster, what you're doing is helping address basic needs, connect with social supports and tangible supports, and provide a few psychoed coping skills and referrals in case you notice XYZ. So that's really what we did after Maria. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into the data and what we did, but I promise you there'll be other opportunities. 3 to 6 months after a major disaster is when you really start offering that tier 2 level intervention, which is still not therapy, but it's evidence-based coping skills, usually on a cognitive behavioral therapy framework. And one model developed by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network is skills for psychological recovery, which basically is like taking the evidence-based processes of CBT that work, behavioral activation, effective thinking, problem-solving skills, relaxation, and teaching it based on the need of that kid, family, or person. And anyone can be trained to deliver this. Really, what I'm going to be focusing on today is what we did about a year later. After a disaster is when you start identifying, notice how this needs assessment that I just told you about was 5 to 9 months after Maria to allow time for natural recovery, which 50 to 70% of kids will naturally achieve without intervention, and see what's that 20 to 30% of kiddos who are still struggling and need extra support or therapy. And that's where TF-CBT comes in. By the way, at the end, check out this publication at the Journal of Family Strengths. We detail our entire implementation protocol with the hopes that you can replicate it in your community after a disaster. All right. So this is kind of the timeline, okay? And we're going to focus on that TF-CBT now. So I do, before I go in there, want to highlight, I won't have time to discuss this, but this is really cool. As a result of all of our work in Puerto Rico, one of the biggest needs we identified was training that next generation of mental health providers, social workers, psychologists in evidence-based trauma-focused interventions. Fun fact, not so fun. I left Puerto Rico because I couldn't find access to this when I wanted to apply to grad school. So I remember leaving the island with a commitment that one day we'll be able to start our own training in this in the island so that students won't have to leave. And so we have a separate grant that has been going on for the last 3 years, precisely training the next generation of grad students in everything that I'm describing that we did. So those are just some cool trainings back in the day when we did in person. Let's go back to TF-CBT at the top of the pyramid. So TF-CBT has components, modules that you go by in sequential order. And you provide first information about what trauma is, common reactions, and then you move into how we can relax and regulate. Then you move into identifying emotions, their purpose and what they do. Then you move into what's a thought and how this relates to your emotions. And once you have that base, we call it prac, you start doing gradual exposure to the traumatizing event or multiple traumas through a book, a narrative. And there you integrate in vivo exposure as necessary. And you do this all with the child separately, the caregiver separately. Sometimes you bring them together. And then the child shares their narrative with the caregiver supports and understands. And then we work on prevention and safety enhancement. I simplified that a lot, takes time to learn. If you want more information, our team has translated an entire web course for TF-CBT to Spanish. And that came out of the need to have these materials accessible in Spanish for Puerto Ricans and El Salvador, which we'll talk about next. By the way, where can you find it? tfcbt/es.musc.edu or Google TF-CBT Spanish. So, okay. When we were on the island after Maria, and we met with the Puerto Rico Department of Education, we did an informal needs assessment in candlelight with leadership, really identifying what were their needs. So Puerto Rico, to give you a context, you already know about the hurricanes and everything, but really since the early 2000s, the island went from a financial boom where in the 60s, 70s, 80s, lots of pharmaceutical companies were moving to the island, creating jobs due to tax breaks. They left in the early 2000s because that provision that exempted them from taxes ended. So massive exodus of jobs. On top of that, massive scandalous corruption in the government came out, where we found out that our government had, from every 4 years, indebted us to the point where we were going bankrupt. Tax hikes went up. That combined with the unfortunate US stock market recession and crash of 2008, it was a perfect storm. Many things started happening, and I lived through that in my high school and college years. All my friends were leaving to the US to get educated, to find jobs. All of our parents were losing their jobs. Banks were not financing homes. Most friends lost their homes. And this thing called the brain drain started happening, where the best and brightest were leaving because we have the privilege of being US citizens and could move without visas. This left the Department of Education with only 35 psychologists to provide services for over 300,000 students. As you can imagine, that's impossible. On top of that, in Puerto Rico already, due to our geography, there's a lot of mountains, difficult areas to reach, lots of rural populations where access to mental health care is very limited. There's a lot of stigma still to mental health care. And moreover, there's limited graduate school education on evidence-based psychotherapies, including trauma treatment, and that's slightly changing now, which is amazing. Also, I'm preaching to the choir. Everything that's developed is usually developed in English, and not everyone is bilingual in Puerto Rico. But there were also some really important strengths, and that's so important when we work with community partners. What are your strengths? Because you're still here. There must be something that you're really amazing at, and there is. They had the most committed leadership and staff that you could ever imagine. They did more than 100 psychologists can do with just 35. They were scrappy and had resources. There was a need. Trauma became the highlight of every conversation, and willingness to participate in training and valuing that. So we had a lot to work with. So what did we do? Out of the 35, we offered what's called a certificado diplomado, a training, kind of going back to grad school in TF-CBT, that would last up to 8 months over the course of the year, where we would handhold and provide training, implementation support, consultation until they implemented successfully TF-CBT with 2 to 3 children within schools in Puerto Rico after Maria. That was the goal. Here you see some pictures of us doing that first training, which I'll describe now. And there you see my colleagues, Dr. Dariano, Dr. Stewart, and the amazing psychologist. So the first thing we had to do was make sure that we are having all the materials accessible in Puerto Rican Spanish, which is different from Salvadorian Spanish, Mexican Spanish. And this is very important, everyone. If you find a resource online and you're not fully bilingual, just because it says Spanish or Arabic doesn't mean that it's a good version of whatever it was developed in originally. So this was important. We also realized that the measures, the instruments, were translated some to Spanish, some to not, but the word and the vocabulary still had to be adapted. We also realized that we needed to understand the needs of these providers. So this is just an example of what came naturally out of that work. TF-CBT web was not available in Spanish, so we went to work and did it. Another thing, the CPSS, the RCADs, these measures, we made sure that they were accessible and had visuals that made sense for scoring for our psychologists who may not have been exposed to this in grad school. We also created what we wish we would have had. When I was an intern learning all these TF-CBT, I wish I had a manual that told me session 1, agenda. Here's your resources in English and in Spanish. And that didn't really exist laid out that way. So we created that for them. I wish I would have had a 1 fact sheet of this is the component you're in, how many sessions it should take, and the key activities you must perform to maintain fidelity. So we created that all in Spanish. If you don't do TF-CBT, this might not make a lot of sense, but if you do, you're probably opening your eyes like this because this doesn't even exist in English. And then we use what's called a learning collaborative model. Listen up. If you want to make an evidence-based, insert whatever, treatment, strategy, be part of the community, you can't just helicopter in, teach about it via PowerPoint slides, and leave and hope for the best. That's not going to work. Literature shows us that we need to provide an orientation first to, this is the commitment. Are you willing to do it? And have providers commit from the beginning, informed consent, right? That's exactly what we did. And from the 35, only 15 to 16 said, yes, I'm willing. That's fantastic, because we know that they'll be there ready to implement. Number 2, pre-training work. Prior to me teaching you this, please read this chapter. Please complete this online course. Start getting your feet wet in the material and asking questions. Then we have our first in-person or virtual training, which is intensive, and we learn the model. Then we have an action period, 3 to 6 months of implementing this with actual patients and meeting with me and my consultants so that we could troubleshoot, aka supervision. And the last one, number 5, let's do a booster. So we make sure we answer lingering questions that you didn't think you might have, but now you know the model. So now you know what to ask. And so that's exactly what we did. And then guess what? It was so successful, and I'll show you some data in a second, with the Department of Ed, that word got around. And that's the cool thing. When you do something well, you don't need to promote it anymore. People come to you because they've heard of the great success. So Aps Healthcare is the greatest community mental health organization in Puerto Rico, serves primarily Medicaid, Medicare, underserved youth. And they contacted us and said, we want this training in TF-CBT. What do we need to do? So we partnered with them and used the same model, kind of reinvented some of the materials, adapted based on previous lessons learned, and then check out what happened. Let me give you a context. Remember colonial context, corruption, poverty. 57% of kids in Puerto Rico, by the way, live below the poverty level. To give you a comparison, that's 13% in the US, 57% in Puerto Rico. Remember Hurricane Maria and all the tragedy that came from that? Well, let me remind you of something I forgot to say. Prior to Maria, 2 weeks before, Hurricane Irma hit the island, another Cat 3, that's Cat 4. Prior to that, the Zika virus was rampant in Puerto Rico. So that's that. Then when we started work with this new cohort, in January and February of 2020, a series of high magnitude earthquakes devastated the southwest part of the island. Puerto Rico's not used to earthquakes. I've never lived through an earthquake on the island. That wasn't a thing. So more destruction, more school closures, a new type of anxiety about this disaster that I have not grown up with or understand, uncertainty of the aftershocks, right? The disaster doesn't end, it continues, unlike a hurricane, where there's a stop to it and then it's recovery time. And then our friend COVID decided to make an appearance in March of 2020 through the wonderful cruise ships that enter our island from Italy. So as you can imagine, this created a massive storm of disparities, chaos, and our psychologists were right in the middle of TF-CBT with her kids. They had just finished prac and were starting the trauma narrative. And they had received a memo that you can't meet in person anymore. We're shutting down. So our team, given our many years of experience with telehealth prior to COVID, were luckily able to rapidly shift. And within 3 weeks of COVID, we were successfully able to train our entire team in telehealth, which they had no experience with, help the agency get a HIPAA compliant platform, help the agency develop workflows, practice telehealth sessions with our amazing postdocs who coached every single provider and patient. And 70% of our patients were enrolled in telehealth, moving through their trauma narrative within 2 to 3 weeks after COVID. Again, I want to highlight, it's not impossible. I think a lot of people say, like, how the heck did you do that? You need a group of committed people who are doing this because it's consistent with their values and not fame. You need people who are knowledgeable and have access to the information, who can communicate it effectively. And you need to get creative. A lot of this consultation happened via WhatsApp voice messages of like, have you tried clicking on this button? Okay, no, okay, have you tried, okay, send me the link, I'll join you and I'll help you, okay? So technology. Andel Nicasio, who's now a faculty member at Alviso University in Puerto Rico, created these amazing 101 how to use Zoom back then when that was okay to do under the emergency to use Zoom so that they could download this. We also rapidly created telehealthfortrauma.com using WordPress. We had never created a website. Dr. Regan Stewart created this, and we were able to transition for the first time from conference calls to Zoom to have our consultation calls. And that's a picture of our graduation day with one of our groups. I mean, even the idea of having a virtual background and being able to celebrate people was an innovation at the moment. So we're very excited. So now for the data. I'm showing you data combining the Puerto Rico Department of Education cohort and the community mental health cohort. Together, they saw 106 youth over the last 3 years, mean age of 10, half female, referred by everyone and their mother. And here are the index traumas. For those of you who are not in the trauma field, index traumas refer to the primary trauma that's driving symptoms for this child, even though they might have had other co-occurring traumas, okay? The most common one identified was traumatic loss or grief. And this is very important. Oftentimes people think that the index trauma will be the disaster that brought your team there. But what we find in the literature is that really what disasters do is exacerbate pre-existing traumas and fill that cup to the point where that kid is now unable to manage the loss due to homicide of their father. And even though Maria's there, it's really that homicide that was unprocessed, untreated that needs attention now. We also saw a lot of gender-based violence in Puerto Rico. In fact, the government of Puerto Rico has declared gender-based violence a national emergency. And I encourage you to read more about the crisis happening in Puerto Rico. Sexual abuse, bullying in schools, and then Hurricane Maria. So this is really interesting. Notice too how kiddos in Puerto Rico now had an extra natural disaster, earthquakes. And this, we didn't even include COVID because none of our kiddos were in assessment phase when COVID happened. It happened post. Okay, some data here. Let me orient you. So we taught the providers as part of their training how to collect evidence-based measurement, pre-treatment, post-treatment for PTSD. We use the child PTSD symptom severity scale where 31 or greater is probable PTSD. We collected that from the child and from the caregiver. And when I say we, the therapist administered this to their patients essentially. In an interview format, even though you could do self-report, we encourage them to do it in an interview format. Then we taught them how to use the revised child anxiety and depression scale, revised, the RCADS. Why? Because it's freely available, open access, comes with an Excel scoring program, and our therapists frankly love that. So a T-score of 70 or greater is clinically significant. What do I want to orient you to? Okay, the red box. Pre-treatment, according to children, about more than half were in that moderate severe PTSD range. Post-treatment, according to their own report, 6% were. Caregiver, confirmatory. And the Cohen's D, the effect size for this effect was very large for children, 1.43, and very large for caregivers, 1.59. This wasn't a predominantly depressive anxious sample, and that's just, in fact, not the main sample that the therapists were trained to identify, but it's notable too to see T-scores declining, even though they weren't significant to begin with. So lessons learned in the Puerto Rico implementation work. Listen first. We have a paper published in the American Psychologist about this theme of, as scientists, we often want to go in and impose because we know what's best, but really as scientists and as citizens of this world, our role is to listen to the people who live daily with an experience and to tailor what we know to their needs. I'll give you an example of this. Recently, I was contacted by a community mental health organization in Puerto Rico with a need. I couldn't fulfill that need because it wasn't an area of expertise, but I knew who. And so I connected them to that excellent person in Puerto Rico who can help and brokered that relationship. That's an example of humility and knowing when to step back so that needs can be addressed. Provide a menu of options, especially in a post-disaster context with taxed leaders who have so much to manage. Give a menu, and then they can pick from that. Don't make them tell you, what do you need? What do you need? That's not helpful sometimes to just stay at that. Tailoring, adapting continuously. The name of the game is, oh, that didn't work, let's try this. That didn't work, let's try that. Having a team that can help, and careful not to become a burden, meaning, oh, I don't speak Spanish, but I really want to help. So can you coordinate an interpreter for me? That is so not appropriate, especially after the post-disaster context where people are learning again to live and trying to survive with limited resources. And then don't just helicopter in. Whenever you enter a partnership with a community agency, be ready to do it long-term. If you can't do that, reconsider if this is the best time for you and your team. I'll share too my own experience as a Puerto Rican in the diaspora, meaning leaving the island to work, to live, to educate myself. I was met with a lot of resistance from some academics on the island who did not feel that my presence was welcome. And that was very hard for me with statements such as, you left, what do you know? You didn't live through Maria. And with many tears and hurt, I realized that they were right. And that I needed to understand that even though we share common identity, we didn't share a common experience, that my conditions of living were way different, that I had many different perspectives in them. And I needed to step back and allow space and know where I was not welcome and let that heal. And eventually those relationships have flourished, but it took me years to show that I was really serious about collaborating. And that's a whole new different topic. Also, perspective taking. Try to imagine, what would have I liked if I was receiving this training? What would I want? What would my students want? And try to build upon that, and having fun as a team and remembering why you're doing this. So in Puerto Rico, we're going to continue providing training and trauma-based focus interventions. We're going to continue providing access via telehealth and training in that. And one really cool program is our partnership with the University of Puerto Rico Psychiatry Program, residency program, where they're beaming into schools and providing teleconsultation. So it's really exciting to see how telehealth can be taken to the next level. That picture on the right is the first school where we installed telehealth programming for this pilot program in 2018. And the school didn't even have Ethernet or internet. And the IT people installed it for the first time in that school. And they've been benefiting from checking in with psychiatrists and consulting on their cases, which was really amazing to have during COVID. So you never know what you do now that can impact the world later during a crisis. So start building those partnerships now. I recommend these readings. You'll have the slides if you want to learn more about what you just saw. Number 2 in particular is awesome for the blueprint of what we did, because sometimes as scientists, we don't write that stuff up. So I commend journals who allow that space for protocols to be written down. Our last discussion, and then we'll end here and for questions. Leo, how many minutes do I have so I can time myself?
You have about 10 minutes. 10 minutes left for.
Excellent. I only need 6. We're good.
For questions, yeah.
So let me back up. Okay. So it's almost like I feel like we're on a tour, right? We started in South Carolina, low-resourced, underserved communities. We then moved to Puerto Rico, post-disaster context. And in conjunction with that work doing this, we started El Salvador. And the El Salvador project came about because we had someone who had worked at the National Crime Victim Center, now was working as part of USAID, contact us saying, we want to bring some sort of assistance with creating trauma-informed practices in El Salvador, funded by USAID. To give you some context, because I didn't know anything about El Salvador. El Salvador is a Central American country. Big picture, 30 to 60% of children in Latin America have experienced some sort of traumatic event, similar to the US. The difference is Latin American countries have long-standing, ongoing histories of political instability, gang-related violence, poverty, forced migration that further put youth at risk, okay? I didn't know that El Salvador had been in a civil war up until the mid-90s that forced almost 1/4 of their population, 1/3 out of the country, okay? And recently we published a study in the Journal of Traumatic Stress showing that 35% of students evidence PTSD symptoms. So there's a lot of need here. And it's estimated that 70% of youth in Latin America don't have access to any mental health treatment, let alone trauma treatment. So that the situation is pretty grim. So we were contacted and told, we can give you 11 months to implement a pilot of TF-CBT from start to finish. Most people would laugh at that and say you're crazy. Our team said, if that's what you've got, let's do it. And the reason I want to say we were able to do that is because we had already the foundation with our Puerto Rico work in terms of tools and resources and procedures and workflow and lessons learned. The other thing too is if you want to do global mental health work, you have to realize the world doesn't function on your timeline. The world functions on the real world timeline. So what we did, we were flown out in January of 2018, actually, to do a needs assessment with various agencies, understand their barriers or facilitators or expertise, understand the context. And from there, we learned the following. In El Salvador, you can be a psychologist and can provide mental health services with a bachelor's degree. And many psychology programs at the bachelor level don't have practicums. So you might graduate and never have seen a patient face-to-face. You receive the theory. CBT is not the norm, although in some programs it is. And most psychologists in El Salvador are still very much functioning as case managers. That's really the understanding of a psychologist's role. Social workers are not, there's no clinical social worker training program in entire South America, Latin America, and it's starting up in Puerto Rico. So just to give you some context. So we partnered with an agency, FUMPRES, which was the only community mental health agency in that moment offering a CBT certificate. So there was some knowledge base there. And we did the same learning collaborative model with 15 psychologists. We expanded that to a longer training, 3 days instead of 2 to really understand the context, and implemented TF-CBT. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into all the amazing stories about this, so I'm going to jump in data mode. But no, I'll give you a paper. This is published, so you can see the paper, what we did. Wow, guys, oh my God. Within 3 months, we had already surpassed our goals for recruitment and had to start a waiting list. So 121 kids participated in this pilot, even split, girls, females, boys, girls. We implemented it in 5 schools and 1 community mental health clinic, and 70% of children and caregivers opted to receive treatment in schools. So again, addressing that barriers and access to care. Again, similar to Puerto Rico, the index traumas were looking the same. Traumatic loss and grief, DV, physical abuse, sexual abuse, interestingly, serious accidents. So we learned that in El Salvador, a lot of motor vehicle crashes happen, and many people don't receive adequate care in their hospital system. So there's a lot of traumatic injuries that don't receive attention or treatment. The results were also amazing. I mean, 86% of kids completed all components of TF-CBT. The dropout, 7 were unknown, but the rest had to do with moving to another colonia, leaving treatment for medical reasons. And we did have a kiddo that was severely suicidal and had to be hospitalized and kept there. And also we had 95% caregiver participation, even higher than Puerto Rico, which was also high. And everyone finished treatment in the average number of sessions you would expect. This is pretty remarkable considering the limited resources and knowledge a lot of these psychologists had, that they were able to learn a CBT model in such a short amount of time and do it phenomenally well. The effects were also amazing. This sample was way more severe than the Puerto Rico sample, which is interesting given the context wasn't necessarily post-disaster, but it definitely was basically a war zone of gang violence is a primary concern. So we had significant reductions pre to post child and caregiver report and PTSD symptoms. Look at these large effect sizes for PTSD. Anxiety, the same, massive reductions in anxiety. Look at the effect sizes as well. And then the same for depression. Sorry, I inverted those. So the conclusion here was 9 out of 10 children got better. Every single, in PTSD symptoms, every single kid with depression or anxiety symptoms got better. And we were able to prove that it was feasible, acceptable, and effective to implement TF-CBT in Puerto Rico, in El Salvador, in San Salvador. We were invited to present these results to the Ministry of Health, the Office of the President of San Salvador, the Ministry of Education, and that's a picture of us doing that. So that part of giving back, here are the findings. And we created this fact sheet, one's in English, one in Spanish, visually appealing of what were the results of our studies. We also had 2 other components I didn't discuss here, but we gave that back to these agencies and stakeholders. And the lessons learned here were, again, drawing on that local expertise, adapting to the context, but also remembering the big picture. So a lot of the times we had so many struggles. El Salvador doesn't really have a child welfare system. So figuring out what to do with abuse reports, ongoing violence, mandated reports was a challenge. And we had to really remember the big pictures, protecting kids, helping them feel safe. So we had to get really creative and working with the structure. We also had to remember that these psychologists themselves, many were trauma exposed, and we had to tend to their feelings and provide an environment for healing. So lots of lessons learned. Needless to say, it's really cool. I still WhatsApp with these psychologists. They still contact me. In fact, I'm meeting with them after this, and we're going to provide them with some implementation support via telehealth. So this continues, and we have some future directions that we need grant funding for. So in conclusion, what have we learned implementing TF-CBT in these 3 very different but similar contexts? CBPR, community-based participatory approach, is the key. Focus on number 2, for interventions that have a lot of evidence that they work, like TF-CBT, focus on adapting the implementation strategies, the periphery, and tailor that. There's really no need to change a package that works as long as you have evidence that it's been used on that population before and worked. Draw on local expertise, empower communities. We need to decolonize psychology and social work. What I mean by that is, yes, it may have been developed in the mainland US, but we can't just assume that is truth with a capital T. We can't just assume that equally amazing and effective interventions haven't been developed in other countries. And so we need to really challenge ourselves to not come from this presumptuous view that I have the answer and you just need to learn it. Don't helicopter in. Cultivate and maintain long-term relationships, even if sometimes it means that your research project didn't move forward because it wasn't in the best interest of that partner. It's okay. You don't come first. They do. And then a commentary on open access. Our most widely read publication has been the only one we published in an open access journal. That's the one that all of Puerto Rican's colleagues and departments are finding online. We need to do better. We need to make sure science is open to everyone. And if you want to do a real world impact, remember that sometimes it's all about getting service grants and doing program evaluation of what worked, not just a research study. So I'll conclude with some pictures of our publications. Fun fact, I don't like writing, but I have to so people can read our work. So if you don't like writing manuscripts, you're not alone, but it's possible. I just have a good team that helps me get through it. And there's my contact info. So Leo, I'm done.
Awesome. Thank you, Rosaura. This has been great. I know we're at the top of the hour, but that's totally okay. This is great information. Thank you, mil gracias for all the great work and also for all the great resources. One of the things that I've always appreciated about your work and your team's work is all the resources that you're developing, not only for publication, but all the tools, all the manuals, and really thinking through as a practitioner, what do people actually need to make this happen? So all of that. So I've been keeping up with the chat and sending all the resources in the chat, your publications, your websites, and things like that. So please follow up with Dr. Rosaura if anything is needed. And we are at the top of the hour, so we're gonna end here. Thank you so much, Dr. Orengo Aguayo. Our next CMHR seminar will be in, I know I put it in the earlier, in November, and we'll continue to have our monthly seminars from there. So thank you so much. November 17th from 4 to 5 p.m. Central Time with Dr. Kim. So thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your afternoon. Muy buenas tardes, and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Gracias. Bye.
Bye.